So the other day on my invocation video, I got a comment where somebody said inside their comment that the developers are afraid to make good survivor perks, and I don't really know if that's true. I started going back over the perks, and I went back and watched my old tier list video, which was absolutely terrible. I'll probably never do something like that again. And I started to just kind of think to myself, like, where each of the perks belong. And I tried to count as many A and S tier perks as I could. And out of all of the survivor perks, I came up with about 13-ish. And all of the killer perks, I went and did the same thing and tried to count all of the A and S tier perks. And over there, I counted about 13-ish. It's actually a pretty even spread. But the disagreement that the developers are too afraid to make good survivor perks not making sense on the surface also got me thinking a little bit more about what this person might mean, because I don't think that they meant that the developers are scared to make good survivor perks. I think that what they meant was the developers are scared to make overpowered survivor perks. Here's what I mean. A lot of people remember certain perks throughout the game that were just way too strong on their own. Old Decisive Strike, Old Ruin, Old Dead Hard, both versions, Old MFT. And you'll notice that over time, those perks all had to eventually get nerfed in some different way or the other, because they were very powerful on their own. Think back to the last truly obnoxious killer meta that we had. I remember it. It was Call of Brine, Overcharge, Eruption, and then some random fourth perk that you just threw in just for funsies. It was an absolutely atrocious meta where killers could hold the game hostage for no shit up to an hour by just sitting there and kicking gens over and over and over again and applying so much ungodly amounts of regression to them that it was just impossible to do the gens. You couldn't finish it if the killer was playing everything correctly, and it wasn't that hard to play it correctly either. But the thing is that when that meta was around, the problem wasn't an individual perk, it was those three perks combined, and eventually Behavior took the axe to all three of those perks at the exact same time, which I don't believe was the right move. I think it was mainly Eruption and Overcharge that needed the nerf. I think Call of Brine was perfectly fine, but that's neither here nor there. The point is that when perks are created, if they by themselves can cause misery and become very oppressive, that is when we need to take a look. And so far, throughout history, it was only really one killer perk that was too powerful on its own, which was Old Ruin, which punished you for hitting good skill checks, which is absurd the more that you think about it. But with killer perks, there's been a lot of them, and there's a reason for that. Let's talk about the dynamic of the match for just a moment. I know you guys are probably sick of hearing me say this, but there are 4 survivors and 1 killer. All 4 survivors have one goal: finish generators. The 1 killer has 3 goals: defend generators, chase survivors, down survivors, or down survivors, hook survivors, whichever way you want to put it. The point is the killer has 3 goals. In order to even the playing field, the killer has to create secondary objectives for the survivors in order to slow them down enough so that the killer can go out of their way to actually do the other 2 parts of its goal, which is hook and kill survivors. So the killer does this through a myriad of reasons. The powers help them in chases faster, help them get ambushes, help them lock down areas, etc., etc. And then there are some killers that have secondary objectives built into their power: Pinhead, Pig, Plague, Sadako, etc. But then there are a lot of killer perks designed around the idea of implementing secondary objectives to the survivors. Hex perks are there, and then there's perks that assist the killer in slowing down the generators even more. But the main way that killers are able to introduce a secondary objective is by downing and hooking survivors. But despite this gigantic discrepancy where one person has to come up with a bunch of different ways to slow down the other four people, there is still the thing that the killer only has 4 perks and all 4 survivors have 4 perks apiece. And there is no like anti-repetition system in place, which I'm not arguing that there is. I'm just explaining the dynamic to you guys for a second so that we can get to the very meat of this conversation. So there are 12 survivor perks for every 4 killer. Sorry, I can't do math. There are 16 survivor perks for every 4 killer perks. So the killer perks, by definition, just like the killer, need to be more powerful than each of the individual survivors and each of their individual perks and builds. The secondary problem that arises when designing survivor perks is the fact that all 4 of the survivors can have a copy of the perk. So back in the day, I made a video called 7 different survivor perks. And the first perk in that video I called Courageous Tackle. It was a perk that after a few conditions, you could charge forward very shortly and shoulder tackle the or shoulder check the killer and stun them for X amount of time, and that would exhaust you. In the comments of that video, a lot of people rightfully pointed out that that kind of perk would be too much because all 4 survivors could technically have it. And so all 4 survivors would get this really good stun ability, and it could end up stun locking the killer and causing frustration and even being overpowered. And so a lot of people tried to fix the perk itself. I'm not going to get into all that. The point is that I did not think about this when I was designing that perk. A lot of people don't think about this when they're designing perks or when they're trying to change perks. And Behavior thought about this with the invocation perks. But the way they thought about this kind of sucks. So the way that invocation perks work is when a survivor with the invocation perk goes down to the basement, their aura is revealed to all of the other survivors in the trial. If another survivor joins them and doesn't have an invocation perk, there's a 50% bonus to the timer, to the time it takes to do the invocation. If a survivor joins them and they do have an invocation perk, there's a 100% bonus to the time it takes to do the invocation perk, which seems like a really good trade-off for having multiple survivors have invocations, because once the invocation is over, all the survivors in the trial cannot use their invocation perks. So if you've got, let's just say for simplicity's sake, we have 2 people who have invocation perks. One of them understands that Weave of Spiders is best used in the mid to late game to finish off generators that are almost done, or to break a 3-gen or something like that. The other survivor just really likes the idea of knocking 15% off every generator on the trial and wants to use it on as many generators as possible. So when the first survivor goes down to the basement and they get on their knees like a good girl that they are, and they start doing their invocation, the other survivor with the invocation perk, the one who's trying to save it for an important part, has to look at them in the basement and go, fuck, either I go help them now so they waste less time and I lose my perk, or I don't help them, they waste more time and I lose my perk. And so this is going to end up feeling kind of bad in solo queue. But this is how the devs decided that they were going to try to prevent multiple survivors from getting this perk. And then, all the survivors sit in the basement. All 4 survivors bring an invocation or Weave of Spiders, right? In fucking like 15 seconds, they knock 15% off every generator. And then they all sit down again. And let's say that the original person who casted it, maybe they don't have the invocation perk anymore, like technically. So instead of another 15 seconds, it might take 30 seconds or something like that, right? And then the next person, but basically after like 5 minutes of all 4 of these people doing the thing, every single generator will be completed 60%. Assuming that the killer just doesn't kick a single generator and doesn't ever think to check the basement in those 5 minutes, which I guess is a possibility. So I see what they're trying to do. I do see the problems with not just letting multiple people have an invocation perk. But the thing is that the point is rather is that behavior has to keep in mind when they design perks whether or not it's going to be problematic if all four survivors have it. If we go back to our discussion from earlier and we start talking about how survivor perks, how there all the problematic survivor perks that have been nerfed in the past were solo perks, were perks that were good by themselves and only by themselves, and were oppressive by themselves. Decisive strike, old dead hard, made for this, etc., etc. With those perks, if all four survivors have those perks, then you're talking extremely oppressive gameplay for the killer. Now I know that there's going to be somebody who's like, "Oh my god, you're freaking entitled killer main. You just want things to be easier for you." Shut the fuck up for a second and think for a moment. The fact that if all survivors have a powerful perk, have a stupid powerful perk, think about how that oppressive that can be in today's climate. With the perk, no real, I don't see any survivor perk by itself being stupid oppressive, right? Or yeah, stupid oppressive. I just see a bunch of powerful perks, right? If all four survivors have adrenaline, for example, right? Just for example, this is one of the best. This is one of the best survivor perks in the game. All four survivors have it, and all four survivors are alive at the end of the trial. And that last gen pops. If you don't have exposed, you get fucked. You know what I mean? Like that feels so shitty, especially if you're like, Legion or Dredge or Wraith, or, one of these hit and run killers. If you're one of them and you're like, yeah, I've got 3 injures, but they're about to complete it, but that's okay. I could probably still get one down and then maybe try to mind game the hook and healed, dove. And it's like, what the fuck just happened? And that's just like a small example. I'm not saying nerf adrenaline, just don't nerf, leave adrenaline alone. It's good. Okay, it's good as it is. The point is that survivor perks have to be significantly weaker than their killer perk counterparts because there is a chance that 4 survivors can have those perks. And because there's a chance 4 survivors can have those perks, it makes it more difficult for the killer to do their job of applying pressure to the survivors and forcing secondary objectives on them to slow the game down enough for them to do something. Because if the killer didn't have the ability to force secondary objectives, every single game would end in 6 minutes. And every single game would end in 6 minutes, and every killers would lose practically every game, and it wouldn't be fucking fun for anybody involved. The point is that I don't think behavior is afraid to make good survivor perks because we have good survivor perks. I think behavior is afraid to make powerful, like really powerful survivor perks. They're afraid to make survivor perks that will be a problem in mass. If all survivors are running it, it's a problem. But that's the end of today's video. Please let me know what you guys think down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. As always, these videos are not made for me to just spout my opinion at you. They're made for me to also hear your opinion on the subject matter. And as always, before we get out of here, please give a special thank you to our channel members along with me, Nuclear Bomb, Cat Lover, and Spirit Upgrades for their additional support. I really appreciate that from them. Other than that, I love you guys so much, and I will see you in the next one.